Today's episode is a gem of an experience. We have Albert Flynn Desilver with us today, and we've got some really deep subject matter to go into. A subject matter that's relevant to all of us, regardless of our art form or communication mediums. He and I had so much in common, but also so many differences, just because my art forms are in music and his art forms are in literature and writing and poetry. He just published this beautiful book called Writing as a Path to Awakening, a year to becoming an excellent writer and living an awakened life. And I highly recommend that you dive into this book with me, because I can tell it was crafted with such care for us writers and readers as intentional humans. It's really, really beautiful. If you are not familiar with the rest of Albert's work, he is an internationally published poet, memoirist, and novelist. He is highly regarded and sought after as a speaker and a workshop leader. He's taught with people like Elizabeth Gilbert, Cheryl Strayed, Maxine Hong Kingston, and a U.S. poet, Laureate Kay Ryan, and bunch of other people. You'll hear snippets of other really impressive feats of career bravery and experience on his end throughout the rest of this conversation. But I just really want to convey that this is really a really great episode. As always, links to everything Albert and I talk about today are found in the show notes for this episode. Just go to barenakedbravery.com and search Albert, and his face will pop right up. Beyond that, I just want you to grab a cup of tea, pull up a chair, and let's plug in and dive into all of this wonderful stuff with Albert Flynn Desilver. You're listening to Bare Naked Bravery, a weekly podcast hosted by me, Emily Ann Peterson. As a singer-songwriter, author, teaching artist, and creative entrepreneur, I encounter some really fascinating stories. I'm on a mission to reveal the depth and width of bravery and its benefits to creatives like yourself. More than ever today, our world needs bravery, unique bravery, from everyone. This is the place where you find it. There is no script or censorship today, because that's how these facets of Bare Naked Bravery are in real life. So if you're listening with little ears nearby, please know that some episodes may contain mature language and subject matter. One of the easiest ways you can share bravery with the world is to send this episode to a friend or two. Send them an email, text, or tweet, tag them in one of my Instagram posts, my handle is Emily Ann Pete, or leave us a review on iTunes. It takes seconds and can be done from your phone right now. Again, we need more bravery in the world, so let's be brave together. Are you ready for some Bare Naked Bravery?
I am ready. I'm feeling brave.
Good. That's good. Sometimes bravery doesn't always feel like bravery.
No, it doesn't.
You have this book that just came out, and it's really a beautiful book. Like, beautiful in all the ways that I can think of having a book. I can tell that you put so much thought and care into how it was structured. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for saying so.
Yeah. For those of you who haven't gotten a hand on Albert's book, it's called Writing as a Path to Awakening, a year to becoming an excellent writer and living an awakened life. And he's got every chapter in the book represents a month in the year. And I think it's just, there's so much peace in that. I don't know why peace was the first word that came to mind when I saw that, but I was like, oh, that's so much. There's so much forgiveness in saying you don't have to be a writer or a perfect writer all at once or in 6 weeks or 12 weeks. It can take you a long time, and that's okay.
Yeah. And the year is just kind of a little framework, a little guideline. And it's also themed. Each chapter is themed.
How did this writing process for this, because I know you are a writer in general. This is not just the only book that you have, but you're a writer, you're a poet, you're a teacher. What was the process of collecting all of this information and this knowledge like in this book for you?
Well, it started way back when, a long time ago. When I was born, a little baby in Connecticut. Part of that's true. And the other part is that the real inspiration for this, I think, arose out of the workshops. I had been teaching these Writing as a Path to Awakening workshops at various venues like Spirit Rock Meditation Center and Shambhala Mountain Center and the Omega Institute and Esalen Institute, places like that. And I just thought, wow, this curriculum could really work pretty well as a book project. And I hadn't actually written a nonfiction book before. And so it became another challenge to myself to see if I could do it. I'd been writing poetry for 15 years when I came upon this whole memoir thing. I don't know how else to explain it, but this memoir sort of obsession and curiosity. And so I set about a challenge to write a memoir, but I didn't know how to write a memoir. So I had to do tons of research. And the same was really true with this book. I'd never written a nonfiction book. So I had to do a lot of research. How do you write a nonfiction book? Like, how do you write a good nonfiction book?
Right.
And I mean, I had a little bit of a vague framework, but that really needed to be ironed out, and fortunately I got to work with a number of really terrific editors, which is part of a funny story because one of the editors rejected the book ultimately.
Interesting.
after helping me sculpt this thing quite detailed, we went pretty deep, and then she just decided that she didn't want the book. And I was like, oh, at first devastated. I was like, oh, well, that's weird. But, as is my way, I just keep moving. I sort of dust myself off. I dry the tears, and then I put the manuscript, or in this case, the proposal, in another envelope. And envelope, I put that in quotes because it's a digital envelope. But, and sent it off to another publisher. And that publisher said no. And then finally I connected with Sounds True.
And my question is that, so this editor, basically you had to start from ground zero again. Is that what I understand?
Well, no, actually I got to start from quite a ways up the mountain.
That's nice.
Because we had created a lot together. She's a professional editor at a major publisher. Mm-hmm. And she actually works with a very dear friend of mine. That's how I got the connection. And so it was a little bit odd that she decided that she didn't want it, but that's okay. At a certain point in this world of creativity, as you well know, it becomes a question of people's aesthetic preferences and opinions.
Right.
And so I thought, all right, well, she doesn't like it, so somebody else will probably like it because I think it's pretty darn good.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you kept going. Thank you for that. This brings up a subject that we talk about a lot. We talk about rejection a lot on the show because, a lot of times when we are brave, there's that risk involved. And a lot of times the risk is the risk of being rejected or banished or whatever, you fill in the blank. As a professional writer, how have you learned to deal with rejection?
Well, I think I started early. I started early just with some sense of tolerance for abuse and rejection. I've never actually thought about this in this way, but there must be some correlation between, and I literally experienced violence and abuse as a kid. And that's like a whole nother story that's covered quite a bit in the memoir, Beamish Boy. But I never really thought about it in terms of like how I might endure psychological or aesthetic, emotional rejection via my creative life. And I don't think I've actually ever talked about this. So
let's unpack it now.
Yeah, here we are. So I, when I started as a writer, I was still very lost. I had been in a graduate art program. Well, first as undergrad in photography, and then I moved to San Francisco, and I somehow wiggled my way into a program at the San Francisco Art Institute in photography. And after my first year of flailing around and experimenting and having a lot of fun being in San Francisco, but not a lot of focus, I ended up failing my year-end review.
Hmm.
Like, how do you fail in art school, right? Especially graduate art school. But I managed to do it. And so I somehow I have this tendency to just keep squirming and keeping curious and keep thinking there's got to be another way around this whole rejection or this quote unquote failure. And so I transferred to a different department. That was my way out. It's like, well, I'll just go to the new genres department and they'll take care of me there. They'll believe in me. So I redid a whole, like, some wacky installation piece. And one teacher showed up from the new genres department. He passed me. And ta-da, I made it through and I graduated.
Now that's what I call ingenuity. I mean, nice.
Yeah, I had to sort of wiggle my way through it somehow. But, I think it gave me a little bit of a tolerance for when I started a few years later. I started writing and then thinking that, well, I want to send this writing out in the world. I want to see what it's like to get published, or what would that be? And started sending out work, and it got rejected. But I just had this determination. And part of that might have been some sort of a survival instinct. And I couldn't reconcile, like, I couldn't figure out, nobody ever gave me a good answer of, like, why this person, X, Y, and Z, was published and was even celebrated and written about, while this other person wasn't. And like, it never made clear sense to me. And even as my work started to develop and I started to learn more and my writing got a little bit better, I couldn't figure out why this person's was viewed or perceived as better than mine was. So that kept me going. That kept me, like, submitting. And then I got kind of obsessive about it. And I have a little funny story about do you know the magazine Ziziva?
No.
Oh, Ziziva magazine. It's a legendary West Coast literary journal.
I'm going to go Google it and have all sorts of fun, because that sounds right up my alley.
Yeah, it's a terrific magazine. It's been in existence forever. And it's kind of the creme de la creme of West Coast literary and arts journals. And they publish photography and art and criticism and poetry. And I always, like, from the get-go, I was like, I want to be in Ziziva one day. And so I started submitting probably earlier than I ever should have. But I couldn't resist. And I got just rejection letter after rejection letter after rejection letter. And, at first it was 5 and then 10 and then 15 and then 20. And I just kept submitting. And I would get these little slips that just said onward from the editor, whose name I'm totally blanking on right now, but maybe it'll come to me later. And then after the 48th or 49th submission, he finally took a poem. Ta-da! And I felt like I had made it. Felt like I had made it in life.
He left the word onward, like, as like a signing off the letter kind of thing. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, it was a form slip that just said, thanks for submitting to Ziziva, onward. Howard Junker.
Well, thank you, Howard.
Yeah, thank you, Howard. I know, I'm forever indebted. And that poem, to this day, I still love that poem. I mean, why not? But that was a kind of endurance test of rejection right there.
I mean, 50 times, that's impressive.
Yeah. Well, one hears so many amazing stories of, and I heard these stories too, of legends in the world of writing and art who had, for these just massive best-selling, terrific books that had gotten rejected by, 30, 40, 50 publishers.
Right.
And then finally someone sees it, someone gets it, and they publish it, and it becomes this great inspirational work in the world.
Is there a specific book that you're thinking of, or a specific one of those stories that you looked to as, like, well, if they kept trying and they made it, then I can do it too?
It's not coming to mind right now.
Yeah.
There's so many great examples, and I just can't think of.
Oh, yeah.
I can't think of one now.
Do you have a special place for all of your rejection letters?
I don't. They're all gone. They just vaporize. I don't pay much attention to them. I know there are a lot of people who would just sort of put them up on their walls. Mm-hmm. And I just never really felt inclined to do that.
Yeah.
What I put on my walls was the ones that I actually got published in. That's what I wanted to focus on, because then I figured that Well, if I focus on that, those are the wins, right? I keep focusing on the wins. Maybe they'll multiply.
Right. Yeah.
They'll have sex with each other and
Yeah.
keep multiplying.
Duplication.
Yeah.
I am curious the content of your book is all about writing so that you can find enlightenment or find your true self, and you're writing not to put things out into the world necessarily, but writing to discover things about yourself.
Well, it's both and. Like,
right.
I was actually just reading last night at Bookshop Santa Cruz, and I was telling the audience about that this book is really kind of for two different people. And one type of person is someone who wants to live intentionally. They want to keep track of their emotions and their ideas and their feelings, and they want to be specific about their desires in this lifetime. Mm-hmm. Like, what do I want in relationship? What do I want in my physical body and my health and wellness? What do I want in terms of money and abundance and care for my family? What do I want in terms of career and creativity? What do I want in terms of spirituality? And so this book is a lot about, well, how do you do that? How do you write into those specific desires with some level of effectiveness? Because I think that writing is one of the most powerful points of focus we have as human beings.
That was actually the quote that I wrote down from your book.
Oh.
Was writing, that exact quote. Writing is one of the most powerful points of focus we have as human beings. And I fully agree with you.
Well, and think about it. When you give attention to a specific thing, it tends to get energy. It tends to manifest in interesting ways. And writing is sort of like double time with that. It accentuates it. It amplifies it. And especially when you come back to a specific intention or a specific goal or specific idea over and over again. So that's one aspect of it. And then the other aspect of the book is really for creative writers. And for people who want to write poems, they want to write scripts, they want to write novels, short stories, whatever. And so there are exercises for both those kinds of people. And there's also a way that the book acts as a support system for the creative writer, because writing, like any art, is extremely emotionally taxing in my experience. And how do we stay balanced in our lives? How do we stay connected and filled with that sense of creative possibility and creative geniusness without losing track of our relationships, without losing track of our health and wellness? Because we all know so many extreme examples of artists who have devoted so much to their art and their geniusness that they've neglected their relationships. They've neglected their own well-being. Yeah. And they become alcoholics and drug addicts and, self-harmers and all of that stuff. And so that's an old tragic paradigm that this book hopes to dispel and move beyond.
Do you find that this book, the audience of this book, because there's those two parties, do you find that one party can learn from the other?
Oh, sure. That's an interesting question. Yeah. It's just a question of openness, being open. I think there is a little bit of a divide between the academic world isn't necessarily going to just vacuum this book up, because they're going to have skepticism. They're going to come to it with a certain level of intellectual bias and certain perception, like, oh, that's spirituality. I don't know what that is. That's not academic. It's not smart enough. It's not, well, whatever. I don't really know how that thinking goes, but I know that there is a thinking that tends to separate. And my intention with this book was to break down some of those divides and make this accessible and inspirational, and even like a very useful, practical tool for academic writers, for any kind of writer, really, to get more balance, to reconnect with that divine self that is literally unlimited when it comes to creativity. So there's no such thing as, like, I don't really believe in blocks, writer's block. If you have writer's block, you're thinking too much. You're spending too much time caught in your head. You're not spending enough time in your body, facing and surrendering to your emotions and writing from your heart. Because when you do that and you get quiet and you get still and you provide space in your life, you realize that there's just this endless stream of creativity that's available all the time. It's just a question of getting out of the way.
Which is such a relief. Right? I mean, when you sit down into the table and you've got that blank sheet of paper and it's just staring at you.
Uh-huh.
That is so nerve-wracking to think, especially if you have really high expectations of yourself and you're thinking, I have to write the greatest thing known to man in the next 15 minutes.
Right. And, one of the most liberating pieces of advice that I've ever heeded and acted upon was from, Annie Lamott.
Oh, yes.
Who talks about writing shitty first drafts.
Oh, yeah.
And I think if you allow yourself to write crap and realizing that all the great writers in the world started that way, like they all started writing crap. Even the exceptionally geniusy ones, they started at an early age writing crap, and then eventually whatever kicked in and they started writing well. But it's just, it builds upon itself. And when you stick with it and you practice and you keep at it, it starts to shape into something meaningful and interesting and dynamic and communicative. And that's the trick, though, is just allowing you to be a little bit uncomfortable with the initial gesture.
Well, I mean, as a songwriter, I know that there are days when I wake up and I go, oh, today I have to write a shitty song.
Right.
I just know that the thing that is in me that I really want to write is the thing in between me and the thing I really want to write is a shitty song. And I just have to write the shitty song.
Yep.
Spend a day doing it and then move on and get to the good stuff that I actually want to put out in the world.
Totally. Yeah. And that's it. And you can't, like you say, you can't get there until you write the shitty song or write the shitty poem or draft of your story or novel or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. It's all about process.
It's true. Totally true. So I just had another really good question and it just escaped me. So I'm going to ask another one. So we have in my thesis for what bravery is, because I started getting really curious about the subject because a lot of people talk about bravery, but there's not a lot of like exact definition for what is bravery and how do we create it and all of that. Mm. So it was this kind of like ethereal, mystical word that people go, oh, they're so brave, or she's so brave, or how so much courage you showed there. But like, what the heck actually is it? And I've discovered that there's these three forms. There's internal bravery, external bravery, and resonant bravery. Mm. So the internal bravery is this bravery that you are experiencing. You are the only one that knows that you are being brave. So maybe you're doing something that's really commonplace for somebody else, but for you on that specific day, going to the grocery store was a really hard thing to do. Mm-hmm. Or the external bravery would be like anything that involves someone else knowing that you're being brave. So usually this is like outward focused activities or actions that you would consider brave. And you can also see somebody else, this is the resonant bravery, if someone else is doing something brave, whether they think it's brave or not is not really the issue. But if you see somebody else doing something and you think that's brave, that's the resonant bravery. Mm-hmm. Based on those three definitions, what have you experienced from teaching this book to so many people? Because I imagine that every time you teach this book or every time somebody goes through this book, they encounter all three versions of this kind of bravery.
Oh, sure.
Do you have any thoughts on that or stories?
Yeah, well, I think, and I always tell this to my students, the first thing is, and I was mentioning this actually last night at this talk about, like, the most radical act in this day and age is to be still. And to enter into silence. That's like a radical act.
Yeah.
Especially when given all the noise that's going on in the world and with social media and just the whole digital thing. So, and that takes a certain amount of courage to enter into silence and to enter into stillness, because we're so conditioned to constantly be distracted and to constantly be moving.
Yeah.
So the experiment becomes, well, what happens when I get still? What happens when I get quiet? And, a lot of people will come and say, oh, I don't know, how do you sit still? I can't sit still. I can't do this. I can't do that. Well, that's a mental construct. You can do whatever you set your mind to do. And in my experience, sitting in stillness, being still, opening up to the true depth and mystery and emotional complexity of who you really are is a profoundly courageous act. And it takes an immense amount of courage to just sit there with yourself. And when I'm saying sit there with yourself, I mean like really feel into all the trauma of what it means to be human in this day and age. The assault of culture, really, and the trauma of an extremely dysfunctional, violent system that is so ingrained in us that a lot of times we just take it for granted as is. But the reality is that it's a system. It's a constructed cultural system based on violence, based on manipulation, based on confusion, and I think a real fear, honestly. One of my teachers, I was co-teaching a few weeks ago up in northern Colorado with Susan Piver and Lodro Rinsler, two really terrific meditation teachers and writers. And Susan was talking about, I think it was one of her teachers, she was quoting, who said, the thing that people are most scared of is space in our culture. Space.
Yeah.
And I thought, wow, how interesting, right? Because space is whenever you meet the dance floor or you meet the page or you meet the instrument or you meet the canvas, it's blank, it's space, right?
Right.
And it's like, there's this initial like, what do I do with all this space? It's terrifying in a certain way because there's an unknown there.
The questions that come up for me are like, am I enough for the space? Am I too much for the space? Immediately going to the boundaries of the space and going, do I belong here in this space?
Well, this is the beautiful thing about meditation and spirituality, because you realize that there are no boundaries and you are enough. In fact, you are more than enough. You are a creative genius. That's like your absolute true nature. And there's no doubt in my mind. I know people get all hung up on that word genius, but I think that each person has infinite potentiality inside of them with a willingness and a courage, a bravery to shed some of that conditioning, to reimagine an identity that is based in love and compassion and creative possibility. When that becomes your base, your ground from which you act and gesture and move about in the world, everything changes because you're not bound by the jousts of culture, and all the hatred and all the violence that's coming at us through the media, through government, through all that external stuff. We can begin to cultivate a ground of love and compassion and spaciousness that feels at home. It doesn't feel like, oh, we're floating and lost and completely untethered, but that we're aligning with a space of possibility and a space of a newly imagined way of being in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yep. If you're listening to this, then you are in the direct line of benefiting from my patrons. This podcast exists because I have the financial and holistic support from a small but mighty group of music lovers and podcast lovers. And if you like this podcast, then I invite you to join them. because becoming a patron of mine costs as little as $1 a month, and there are lots of goodies in store for you. All of my patrons get to request cover songs, they hear brand new songs of mine before they're released, and they get intimate updates on how my creative pursuits are going. It is an extreme honor to share so deeply with folks whose support is so enduring and encouraging. And you can learn more about becoming a patron and join the ranks by going to barenakedbravery.com/patron, Patron. And thank you in advance. It means the world to have people like you supporting work like this. Do you find that people who are fearful of this space end up making different kinds of choices in their own writing?
Sure. I think it's fine to be fearful. Like, fear is not the enemy.
Right.
It's just a question of feeling the fear and doing it anyways. I think that's what makes the difference. People who are willing to feel the fear and hit the page anyways, hit the canvas anyways, hit the dance floor anyways, hit the lyre or the dobro or the banjo or whatever your instrument is anyways, and sing that song. And while you're trembling, right? Mm-hmm. You belt it out anyways through trembling lips and nervous fingers and a quivering throat. And you just allow yourself to do it. That's courage, right? That's bravery.
Yeah.
Because a lot of us just can't. We're just too consumed by the fear. And it can stifle us. But we don't have to be.
I was watching one of my songwriter colleagues teach a performance coaching workshop to a bunch of us other songwriters. And it was the most powerful thing. It was the closest thing I've ever seen to watching real magic, like, or witchcraft or something like that. Because we would start by watching this one person perform their song, the song that they've played probably every single town across the country over the past 2 years, so they know this song like the back of their hand. And then my performance judge person inside of me would immediately go, oh, they need to sing that first verse at a lower, softer volume so that we can hear the words. But the way that Amy Speece, she's this songwriter out in Nashville, the way that Amy walked someone through the journey of finding that fear that we're talking about, of finding that rawness, that was magic. Because I would have just said, oh, you just need to do the thing, right? But she was asking questions like, who did you write this for? No, really, tell us about them. Who was this for and why did you do it? Like, what exactly happened between you two that made you want to write this song or tell us this story or this side of the story? And inevitably, within 10 minutes, the entire room would be in tears because the origin of the art was so close to the absolute center of the artist. And we were seeing that proximity, and that was just so intimate that everybody was just in tears.
Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. That's cool.
Do you find that there's is there a similar thing? Because I'm coming from the singer-songwriter realm, and you're in the poetry writing realm, literature realm. But is there something similar that happens on that side of the fence? The writing side of the fence rather than this?
Yeah. I mean, I've always been curious. I think curiosity is probably one of the great undervalued spiritual attributes. To cultivate curiosity in yourself. Like, who am I really? And what do I think? I don't know until I write it down. What would happen if I tried to write a song or I tried to write a poem? What would that be like to participate in that great mystery of creation? And why not? Why not me? Why do those people get to participate and I don't get to participate? It's always been one of my questions.
Well, I mean, you mentioned that earlier, that, as you were going out into the realms of putting your work out in the world, like doing the external part of this writing process. And I know this to be true in the songwriting world, that like I have friends who write beautiful pieces of music, and I know that they're not going to get the same kind of attention that another friend is going to get. But in the writer's realm, what is that difference, or what is the hurdle that that success is lost under?
Well, it's that same thing. It's that self-recrimination, self-doubt, chronic judgment. I think that there's an issue around devotion. I talk a lot about devotion in this book. And I think if you're really into it, you're really devoted, and you stick with it and you stay with it, you're going to find success, whatever that means to you. And at some point you get clear about that. Well, what does success mean? Does success mean writing a chapbook of poems that I can share with my grandmother and a few family friends? That's great. That could be success. Or is success like, do I have to write the next great American novel? And if so, if that's my bar, my level of success that I'm going to raise the bar to, then I better be willing to work my ass off and really study what that is and what that takes, and really work with the people who have done that. Like study what they do, understand what does it mean to tell a story, and what does it mean to work with language. So there's so many different levels, right? There's such a spectrum of what success is. And we have to, at some point, define that for ourselves and move beyond the judgments and the doubts and the recrimination. Just like surrender to what that space of success is for us.
Yeah.
And then make the commitment and take action.
And it sounds like that mixing that devotion with curiosity ends up has opened doors for you.
Yeah. I mean, there's never really a clear answer. Like, can I do this? When I started writing, I got this notion in my head that I would write a memoir. And I didn't know how to write a memoir. I didn't know how to complete a sentence, really. I had been writing poetry for 12 years. And I was like, God, what's that? How do people tell stories? First of all, about themselves. Like, who really gives a shit about me and my little sad story? And all that stuff goes through your head. And then the studying, because, I knew I had to tell the story. That was first and foremost, right? So I know I have to tell the story for me first. And then I can worry later about whether or not this is something I'm going to share with the world. And then I'm going to have to get to work of understanding what this memoir thing is, really. Am I writing my autobiography? Am I telling a story that's a small section of my life? Or am I writing a third-person biography?
Right.
So, and I just started exploring and experimenting and seeing what I could do. And I finally completed one sentence. And I was like, okay, that means I can probably complete 2. So I'll do 2. And then I'll bundle these together into a paragraph. Well, that's not bad. And, and then it sort of builds from there.
Yeah. So because you've done a memoir, and I find that writing a memoir, writing memoir-ish kind of literature, just the words itself by themselves, that is scarier to me than writing a song about various stories. Mm. And I know that I have hidden my story behind melody and behind the cadence of rhyme, and that those like songwriting structures end up kind of masking the rawness of like details, the details of they did this, they said that, I said this, I did this. In your experience from writing these memoirs and putting these kind of like naked stories out into the world, what process did you go through to either relieve yourself of like okay, let's just do this, or did you have to have conversations with people to warn them that you were going to write about this, or what was that like?
Well, all of that for sure. And like you, except probably in a much more extreme way, I hid out in avant-garde experimental poetry for years. I was writing this very abstract-y, music, sound-oriented poetry that you couldn't really point to a specific emotion or a specific story. But I think it was instructive for me and helpful for me. It was kind of eased me into this whole writing business.
Yeah.
And that's just where I needed to start, because I couldn't, you can't just jump in, be all raw and vulnerable right from the get-go, because it can get pretty intense. It can get pretty tumultuous.
Right.
And then slowly my poetry got a little bit more accessible in some way, emotionally accessible, narratively accessible. And that became more and more liberating. I stopped judging it. I used to think like, oh, well, this really interesting avant-garde experimental poetry is much smarter than that overly accessible narrative stuff.
Right.
Just all these like weird voices you have in your head when you're younger that are just constantly judging and assessing the world. I mean, really, you're discerning. You're trying to make your way through the world. And I remember when my father, at some point, he said to me, he read some of my poetry. He's like, Albert, the whole point is to communicate with people. He's sort of like yelling at me. You're supposed to communicate with people, as if like I wasn't communicating with people. And I mean, I was communicating. I was communicating with like 5 people. I think I had like 5 or 6 readers. But that was the level at which I could do it at that point, right? And I think there's also infinite levels of communication. And I love avant-garde poetry and I love experimental poetry, and I still read it and appreciate it. And I know for myself that I also want to connect with a larger audience. And, I want to communicate some levels of emotional vulnerability and insight that can really resonate.
Yeah.
And not hide out in various twists and abstractions of language, without necessarily sacrificing an innovation and a captivating structure.
Yeah. Ugh. I have a lot of things I want to say, clearly. They all want to come out at once. No, I mean, I fully agree with you that we hide behind or I should say, the things we hide behind, we choose to do that for a reason. And in order to come out from hiding, and sometimes that means to have a bigger audience.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes that just means to have an audience of 2 instead of just the 1. But that bravery to step out from hiding is very intentional and is rarely like a, what the hell, let's just do it. Usually there's a lot of thought and intense analytical, like, is this the right time? Do we do it now? How about now? How about now?
Mm-hmm.
So I can totally relate to that side of your story on that regard. So, whew.
And then, can I just say one other thing about terror and fear?
Please.
Well, so a few years ago, I got invited to do a TEDx talk, and this was also down in Santa Cruz. I have some sort of thing for Santa Cruz, but anyways, that was where the TEDx was, and it was to be at this big theater, this sort of 400 or 500 seat theater, and I just like pumped that thing up in my head in such a big way, like, oh my God, I'm going to be the next Brené Brown. And I'm going to have like 50 million views on this thing. I'm going to crush it. And I actually wrote a pretty good talk, but I made a couple of very grave mistakes, one of which was trying to memorize the thing. And the other mistake was allowing myself to get sort of that caught up in it being this big thing, mm-hmm. which inherently sort of tied it up in my own ego. It became about me and my fear rather than about them and the particular message that I was hoping to get across. Like, it got very confused. And I thought, I'd been around the block. I'd done a lot of talks. I stood up in front of classrooms forever, and I can do this. But, there's something very intimidating about the TEDx format. And, there's the cameras and the big audience, and everybody's sort of smart, and they already know everything. So what the hell are you going to teach them? All that stuff. Mm-hmm. And so I tell this story in the book, actually. And I just got so like physically ill and nauseous from the anxiety about this thing that I was doing pretty good in the talk. You know, it was about a 12 or 14-minute talk. And I got to about 11 minutes and 30 seconds into it. And I got just derailed from my memorization. It just went blank. There was nothing there. And instead of being able to recover and just be in that moment, I just was so consumed by the terror and so mortified that I was just like, well, I guess that's it. And I'm out of here. And I just like ran off the stage.
Oh my gosh. I've totally been there.
Yeah, so it was just amazing. And I learned such a great lesson about, well, first of all, not memorizing. And also like, this isn't about me. Never will I ever go in front of an audience ever again and do that where I get all sort of consumed with my own little petty fears. You know, it's one thing to feel fear, but it's another thing to be taken by it, you know, and to be controlled by it. And 2 years later, I was invited to give a keynote at this writing conference up here in Northern California, actually in Santa Rosa, beloved Santa Rosa, folks who are hurting right now. But there's a really lovely conference they have up there. And I was speaking with Dorothy Allison. Do you know Dorothy Allison?
Her name sounds familiar.
She wrote Bastard out of Carolina. It's this huge best-selling book in the 80s or 90s. They turned it into a movie. Anyways, this woman is a force of nature. She's amazing. And when she talks, she's just like yelling at you. And you're like, yes, Dorothy, I will do whatever you say, Dorothy. And she's just a phenomenal speaker. And I was like, oh my God, how am I going to be on stage with Dorothy Allison? Like, that's, oh my God. So I was sort of freaking out, but then I was like, you know what? I'm just going to be me. I'm not going to get terrified. I'm going to have an outline, but I'm going to largely just going to wing it and be there for this audience to give them what I'm thinking and hoping that they need and want in terms of ideas about writing and inspiration for my story and blah, blah, blah. And I'm going to have fun. And I'm just going to really talk to the audience and be with the audience and not stand behind the podium thinking I've got all the brilliant ideas. And I did that in a completely amazing, different experience altogether. You know, it was just, I had fun. They were engaged. You know, I was excited and nervous, but it was just this beautiful connection and this connectivity and this offering and giving rather than this being consumed with fear.
Yeah. I find that a lot of the people that we end up talking to, they're doing brave things because they have a cause. And sometimes the cause is themselves, honestly.
Right.
But more often than not, the cause is something else or some other group of people that they know they need to talk to or communicate or connect with. And that cause is more powerful than the fear. And so then they do the thing.
Mm-hmm.
But I love that story because I fully stand by that. I mean, I've had my own versions of botching, or what I call the sacrificial pancake concert of the tour, where like the first concert is just like terrible and awful.
Right.
I had a West Coast tour that just went like, it was just bonkers. And because of the tremor in my hand, when my neurology is freaking out with extra adrenaline, my hand freaks out, and then I physically cannot perform like I normally would. So, and it's the same thing happens with other forms of stage fright too. Like you blank out. You can't remember what you're doing. You say the wrong things or whatever. But I spent the remaining part of the tour just, rather than going, I am here to be perfect, being on the stage and playing shows as a present human being. Like as a listening, present human being. And it was a very different tour than I was expecting. It was a very different series of concerts than I was expecting to have, but I learned so much.
Yeah.
And I think my audiences learned more about me as a result of it. You know, it wasn't just, look what she can do. It was, oh, cool, she's here.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, that's just it. It's the difference between being present and available and right there versus being consumed in some abstract sensation of, well, not abstract, I mean, it was very concrete for me, the sensation, but being like just consumed by the sensation rather by being present for the audience. Like, what am I doing standing there freaking out? Like, that's not why I'm here. I'm here to serve and to be present and to show up with a level of vulnerability. And sure, there was a level of vulnerability of just like being there, but freaking out wasn't really doing much for anyone. So, lesson learned. And I vowed, like, I truly, truly vowed in that moment. I'm like, I'm never doing that again. Never, ever. And now I don't really, like, I had no idea last night what I was going to talk about or what I was going to say. I didn't, I used to prepare a lot more remarks, but now I don't trust that anymore. And I'm just there to speak truth in my heart, in the moment, and make a connection with the audience and find out who they are and what they need, because it's about them. This isn't about me. And the same thing with writing. When you write from that point of view, that perspective, you don't get caught up as much. You don't get stuck as much because you're seeing it more as a conversation with your reader.
Mm-hmm. This has been so great, Albert. Thank you for joining us today. I want to thank you for being present here too. Like, that's very evident. It's very evident that you did that in this book as well. And so thank you for writing it and being here. This has been so great.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I really appreciate it. It's been a total joy.
Oh, yeah. Awesome. In honor of Albert Flynn Desilver's beautiful new book, Writing as a Path to Awakening, your brave takeaway from today's show is to do a 10-minute free write exercise on the subjects that he and I talked about. Then I want you to hop into the Bare Naked Bravery community Facebook group to tell us what bubbled up to the surface for you. Was it the subjects of hiding behind things? Was it a subject about getting rejections? What came up for you in this episode? We want to hear all about it. And if you're not a member of the Facebook group, then you can join us by downloading your free bravery bundle over at barenakedbravery.com. You'll get an invite link to the Facebook group from that. And we would love to have you join us and become part of the community officially. It's so fun in there. We have some really wonderful, beautiful humans who are doing some really great, wonderful, beautiful things that are really brave too. I think it's really powerful that we are experiencing each other's bravery in a community environment. Even if it is a virtual community environment, it's still real bravery at the end of the day, and we need more of it. So if you are curious about Albert Flynn Desilver and the rest of his work, then I encourage you to check out the links in the show notes for this episode. Go to barenakedbravery.com, search Albert, and his face will pop up, and you will be able to purchase his book and some of the other things that he and I talked about today. That's it. That's our show this week. I want to thank you so much for listening. Again, we put all the links in the show notes, so go ahead on, do that. If you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it for you, then I encourage you to give us a review and rate the show in your Apple Podcast app or whatever podcast app that you use. It really does help us out a lot because that's just how some of these technological things are built on algorithms. And the more people are engaged with the algorithms, the more people will see the thing that they are engaged with. So that means that you are a part of making sure that people hear the bravery that we discuss on this show. And it's not just, I'm not doing this show just to toot my own horn and to talk about things that terrify me. I mean, that wouldn't sound like something that I would jump into normally, but I want to make sure that you know that you are such an integral part of this Bare Naked Bravery community, whether you're part of the Facebook group or an email list or an Instagram follower or not, like you are part of this. So if you're hearing this and you are inspired to help spread the word, then go for it. Do it. Rating and reviewing the show is a great option for that, but also a simple text to a friend to say, hey, you need to listen to this episode. That's really powerful stuff too. So beyond all of that, if you are digging the music in today's episode, that's because Lee Rosevere did it, and he is sponsoring his music is sponsoring our acoustic environment for this current season of Bare Naked Bravery, and we're really excited about that. So go ahead and check out him and all the other artists and musicians and other sponsors of the show. Go to barenakedbravery.com, and there's a library of resources and things that you can go explore and peruse to your heart's content. Beyond that, I am so looking forward to being with you next week because we have some really cool things in store for you. Until then, as always, I have one message for you. It's this: be yourself, be vulnerable, be brave, be imaginative, be improvisational, because the world needs more of your bare naked bravery.